The scent of stale coffee and sizzling bacon grease clung to the air in the Morningstar diner, a smell Raven had long since stopped noticing. It was just part of the afternoon drone, the lazy hum of a Tuesday that promised nothing more than wiping down sticky tables and refilling salt shakers. She moved with an economy of motion honed by years of practice, her white uniform dress pristine despite the splatter-prone environment, a long red apron tied snugly around her waist. In her hand, she held a thick wooden spoon, its surface worn smooth from stirring countless pots of chili. A man sat alone in the corner booth, nursing a black coffee. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed out of place amidst the cracked vinyl and chrome fixtures. He hadn't said much, just ordered the coffee in a low, quiet voice. Raven knew his type, men who carried a heavy silence around them like a cloak. His name, she'd overheard from his one brief phone call, was Jin-Woo Kwon. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful, but coiled, like a predator at rest. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed, not with the friendly jingle of a regular, but with a discordant, violent clang. 30 men filed in, moving with a chilling synchronicity. They didn't look like customers. They wore matching black jackets, and the faint glint of steel was visible at their wrists and tucked into their belts. The diner's handful of patrons froze. The air crackled, thick with a sudden, palpable dread. The men fanned out, creating a wall of bodies between the door and the corner booth. Their eyes, cold and empty, were all fixed on Jin-Woo Kwon. He didn't flinch. He simply placed his cup down with a soft click, his gaze sweeping over them, calculating. One of the intruders stepped forward, a nasty scar tracing the line of his jaw. "Kwon," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "The Red Vipers send their regards." Jin-Woo's expression remained impassive, but Raven saw the subtle tightening of his shoulders. He was cornered, outnumbered, and unarmed. The men began to draw their knives, long, wicked blades that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The other customers scrambled, hiding under tables, their whimpers lost in the rising tension. Raven, however, didn't move. She simply tightened her grip on the wooden spoon. The leader of the Red Vipers lunged, his knife arcing through the air aimed at Jin-Woo's throat. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing as Raven moved. She was a blur of white and red, her motion not frantic, but impossibly fluid. She intercepted the man's wrist with the handle of her spoon, a sharp, percussive crack echoing through the diner as bone gave way. The knife clattered to the floor. The man screamed, clutching his shattered arm, his face a mask of shock and agony. Before his cronies could process what had happened, Raven was already in motion. She didn't fight like a brawler. She moved like a dancer, each step precise, each strike delivered with devastating accuracy. The wooden spoon was an extension of her arm, a blunt instrument of chaos. She used the bowl of the spoon to hook a man's ankle, sending him sprawling into two of his companions. She jabbed the handle into pressure points, throats, collarbones, the soft tissue behind the knee, eliciting choked gasps of pain and causing men twice her size to crumple. Jin-Woo watched, his stoic facade finally cracking, replaced by sheer, unadulterated astonishment. He had seen violence his entire life. He had orchestrated it, survived it, mastered it. But he had never seen anything like this. This woman, this waitress, was dismantling a team of trained killers with a piece of kitchenware. She flowed through the chaos, her expression calm, her breathing even. A knife sliced toward her face. She ducked under it, the blade whispering past her ear, and brought the spoon up in a hard, upward strike against the attacker's chin. His teeth clicked together with an audible snap, and he fell backward, unconscious before he hit the ground. They tried to swarm her, to use their numbers to overwhelm her, but it was like trying to catch smoke. She was always one step ahead, her spatial awareness perfect. She used their own momentum against them, redirecting a lunging attacker into a wall, using another as a shield against a wild slash. The diner became a symphony of grunts, cries, and the rhythmic thwack of wood against flesh and bone. In less than 5 minutes, it was over. 30 men lay groaning, incapacitated, or unconscious on the checkered linoleum floor. Raven stood in the center of the wreckage, her chest rising and falling gently. Not a single drop of blood stained her white dress. She looked down at the spoon in her hand, then tucked it back into the loop of her apron. She walked back behind the counter, her movements as calm as they were before the storm. Jin-Woo Kwon remained in his booth, the only person other than her still standing. The silence that fell was heavier than the preceding violence. He stared at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief, awe, and something else, something that looked dangerously like hope. He finally rose from his seat, his suit still immaculate, and slowly walked toward the counter, stepping carefully over the moaning bodies of his would-be assassins. He stopped in front of her, the polished countertop the only thing separating them. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear and the lingering scent of chili. Raven met his gaze without expression, her own eyes holding a deep, unreadable calm. She picked up a clean cloth and began wiping a non-existent spot on the counter, her focus absolute. "Who are you?" Jin-Woo's voice was low, cutting through the quiet groans of the defeated men. It was not a question of her name, but of her existence. "I'm the one who serves the coffee," she replied, her voice soft but firm, not a tremor in it. She didn't look up from her task. He allowed a small, humorless smile to touch his lips. "I think you are a great deal more than that." He slid a black credit card across the counter. "For the coffee. And for the entertainment." Raven stopped wiping. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes assessing him with an unnerving intensity. She pushed the card back toward him. "Coffee's on the house," she said. "Consider it a mess-clearing fee." His gaze didn't waver. He saw the strength in her, not just the physical power she had just displayed, but a profound, internal fortitude that was far rarer and more valuable. He was the head of the city's most powerful Korean syndicate, a man surrounded by bodyguards, weapons, and fortifications. And 30 men with knives had just walked through his defenses and nearly ended his life in a greasy spoon diner. But this woman with a wooden spoon had been a more effective fortress than his entire organization. "I require your services," he stated, the words not a request, but a declaration of need. "I will pay you whatever you ask. I'm not for hire," she said flatly, turning to rinse a glass in the sink. "I'm a waitress." "You are a warrior," he corrected her, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more urgent. "And I have enemies who will not stop. They found me here. They will find me again. My men failed me." "You did not," she paused, her hands still in the water. She thought of her overdue rent, the medical bills for her mother piling up on her small kitchen table. She thought of the quiet, exhausting life she lived, always looking over her shoulder, always hiding what she was. This was a dangerous path, a door back into a world she had fought desperately to leave behind. But the money he was offering, the sum she knew a man like him could pay, would be life-changing. It would mean freedom, safety. "What services?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her back still to him. "Protection," Jin-Woo said. "Be my shield. Until the threat from the Red Vipers is neutralized." She turned off the faucet and dried her hands slowly on her apron. She finally turned to face him, leaning slightly against the counter. Her eyes were hard, all business. "My price is $1 million. Half now, half when it's over." She expected him to negotiate, to balk. He didn't even blink. "Done," he said. He pulled out his phone, and with a few taps, a confirmation chimed. "The first half has been transferred to an account I've opened in your name. You'll receive the details momentarily." Raven's own phone buzzed on the counter. She stared at it, then back at him. It was real. The weight of the decision settled on her. She was no longer just Raven, the waitress. She was a guardian, a weapon. She untied her red apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter beside the wooden spoon. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Jin-Woo's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Home. His home was a sprawling penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, black skyscraper overlooking the city. The transition from the sticky floors of the diner to the polished marble of his lobby was jarring. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering urban landscape below, a kingdom of lights that seemed to belong to him. The space was minimalist and severe, decorated in shades of gray, black, and chrome. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress in the sky, beautiful but cold, much like the man himself. Raven felt profoundly out of place in her simple, white dress. Jin-Woo showed her to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. It had its own balcony and an ensuite bathroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury spa. "You will stay here," he said, his tone formal. "You will be with me at all times when I am outside this apartment. Inside, you will have your privacy, but you are to remain on this floor. I understand the job," she said, her voice clipped. She walked through the room, testing the weight of the door, checking the locks on the windows, assessing vantage points. Her mind was already working, mapping out threats, establishing protocols. He watched her, a flicker of fascination in his eyes. His previous bodyguards were all large, imposing men who relied on firepower and intimidation. Raven was quiet, observant, and moved with a silent grace that was far more unsettling. She was a living weapon, and she was now his. The first few days were a study in silent tension. They coexisted in the vast, quiet space, orbiting each other like two celestial bodies bound by a strange gravity. Raven was a shadow at his side, her presence a constant, reassuring weight. When he held meetings with his lieutenants in his stark, glass-walled office, she stood just outside the door, her posture relaxed but her senses on high alert. When he ate his meals at the long, empty dining table, she sat at the far end, eating her own food in silence. She refused the expensive clothes he offered to buy her, continuing to wear simple, practical outfits she had packed in her one small bag. One evening, he found her in the penthouse's private gym, moving through a series of fluid, complex forms. She wasn't using any equipment, just her own body, her movements a mesmerizing blend of martial arts he didn't recognize. She moved with a power and grace that seemed almost supernatural. He stood in the doorway, silent, watching her for a long time. She didn't seem to notice him, lost in her discipline. It was in these moments that he saw her not as a bodyguard, but as an artist, her body the medium for a dangerous and beautiful craft. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer awkward or purely professional. It became comfortable, a shared space that didn't need to be filled with words. He started leaving a cup of the specific herbal tea he noticed she favored on the kitchen counter for her in the mornings. She, in turn, started preparing simple meals for them both, the food more nourishing and flavorful than the expensive takeout he usually ordered. These were small, unspoken gestures of acknowledgement, the first threads of a connection being woven in the sterile silence of his gilded cage. He was beginning to trust her not just with his life, but with his space, his quiet, his solitude. And she was beginning to see the man behind the Mafia boss, a man who was profoundly lonely, isolated by the very power he commanded. One night, unable to sleep, Jinwoo walked into the main living area to find Raven standing before the vast window, gazing down at the city lights. She was dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair unbound, falling softly around her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, without the armor of her professional demeanor. He hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but she spoke without turning around, her voice quiet. "You can't sleep either, it wasn't a question." "The city is never truly quiet," he replied, moving to stand a few feet away from her, following her gaze. They stood in shared silence for a long moment, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. "Why did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, his curiosity finally overriding his restraint. "In the diner. I've never seen anything like it." Raven's shoulders tensed for a fraction of a second before she relaxed. She turned her head to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "My father taught me," she said. "He believed that the world wasn't always a kind place, especially for someone who looked like me. He wanted me to be able to protect myself. To be the rock, not the wave. He taught you well," Jinwoo said, his voice laced with an understatement that was almost reverent. He was a good man. There was a finality in her tone that told him her father was no longer with them. A new layer of understanding settled between them. Her skill wasn't born from aggression or malice. It was a legacy of love, a tool for survival gifted from a father to his daughter. He found himself wanting to know more, not about the fighter, but about the woman. "I apologize for pulling you into this world," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "It is a world of ghosts and echoes." "We all have our ghosts," she replied softly, turning back to the window. "Some are just louder than others." Later that week, he insisted she accompany him to a formal event, a charity gala meant to maintain his public image as a legitimate businessman. Raven disliked the idea, the potential for exposure, the sheer number of variables. but he was insistent. She finally relented, emerging from her room in a simple, elegant black dress that he had laid out for her. It was understated but fit her perfectly, accentuating her quiet strength rather than masking it. He was waiting for her, dressed in a flawless tuxedo. When he saw her, he froze for a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He had only ever seen her in her uniform or casual wear. Seeing her like this, elegant and poised, was a revelation. "You look," he started, then stopped, searching for the right word. "Strong," he finished, a genuine warmth in his eyes. During the event, she was a specter at his shoulder, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd, her body subtly positioned as a shield between him and any potential threat. At one point, a pushy associate tried to corner him, getting too close, his hand gesturing wildly. Before the man's hand could even brush Jinwoo's lapel, Raven's arm was there, a firm but gentle block. Her touch was brief, impersonal, but as her fingers brushed against the fabric of his suit, Jinwoo felt a jolt, a current of electricity that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with her proximity. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and calm, yet carrying an undeniable authority that made the other man take a hasty step back. "You're in Mr. Kwan's personal space." The man stammered an apology and retreated. Jinwoo looked at Raven, whose focus was already back on the room, but he could feel the lingering warmth where her arm had brushed his. It was the first time she had touched him outside of a training context, a small, protective gesture that felt intensely personal. The unspoken tension between them had solidified, becoming something tangible, a low hum of awareness that now followed them everywhere. The attack came a week later, not with a frontal assault, but with the quiet lethality of a sniper. They were on the balcony of the penthouse, the evening air cool and crisp. Jinwoo was pointing out a constellation, a rare moment of unguarded peace between them, when Raven suddenly stiffened. Her eyes, trained to see what others missed, caught a faint glint of light from a rooftop across the way, a lens flare where there should be none. "Get down," she yelled, tackling him. Her body covered his, shielding him as the sound of a high-velocity rifle shot cracked through the air, shattering the glass panel right where he had been standing. Shards of safety glass rained down around them. Without hesitation, Raven rolled off him, pulling him along the floor, keeping them low and out of the line of sight. "Stay here. Do not move," she commanded, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through his shock. Before he could protest, she was gone, disappearing back inside the penthouse. He heard her voice, clipped and professional, speaking into the small communication device she always wore. "Sniper, rooftop, East Tower. Lock down the building." "I'm going up." Jinwoo's heart hammered against his ribs, a cold dread washing over him. It wasn't fear for his own life, but for hers. She was running toward the danger he had brought into her world. He crawled to the edge of the doorway, peering out, but she was already gone. The minutes stretched into an eternity. He heard distant sirens, the muffled sounds of his security team mobilizing. He was a king in his castle, yet he had never felt so powerless. He was used to giving orders, to being in control. Now, all he could do was wait, his life entirely in the hands of the woman he barely knew but was coming to care for more than he could admit. Finally, her voice came through his own earpiece, the one she insisted he wear. "Target neutralized." All clear, the relief that flooded him was so intense it left him weak. A few minutes later, she walked back onto the balcony. She had a small cut on her cheek from the shattered glass and a smudge of dirt on her arm, but otherwise, she was unharmed. She holstered a small handgun he hadn't even known she was carrying. Her eyes scanned the area once more before finally landing on him. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. His carefully constructed control was gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered emotion. He saw the tiny cut on her cheek, the faint tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide. She had faced death for him again. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It's nothing," she said, her professional mask slipping back into place, but her eyes couldn't hide the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, giving her ample time to pull away. He gently brushed his thumb over the cut on her cheek, his touch surprisingly soft. Her breath hitched, and her eyes fluttered shut for a second. The barrier between them evaporated in that single, gentle touch. The air grew thick, charged with everything they hadn't said for weeks. Her gaze met his, and he saw not a warrior, but a woman. He saw her bravery, her weariness, and a vulnerability she kept hidden from the world. He didn't let go. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his gaze intense, searching hers. The city lights blurred into a soft glow behind her, framing her in a halo of light. All the noise, the danger, the entire world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them on that balcony, suspended in a bubble of fragile, potent silence. "Raven," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. It was the first time he had used it. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. It was an admission of trust, an acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them in the quiet spaces and shared dangers. He saw the permission in her eyes, the same raw emotion he felt reflected back at him. Slowly, he lowered his head, his movements deliberate, giving her every chance to stop him. She didn't. Her eyes drifted closed as his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of profound relief and deep, aching tenderness. It was soft, hesitant at first, a question asked and answered. It spoke of gratitude, of awe, of a connection that transcended their strange circumstances. It tasted of the cool night air and the adrenaline that still coursed through their veins. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, not to push him away, but to steady herself, to hold on. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer, closing the final distance between them. It was a kiss that sealed a pact, an unspoken promise of mutual protection. He was no longer just a client, and she was no longer just a bodyguard. They were two lonely, guarded people who had found an anchor in one another. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, their breathing mingling in the night air. "You are more than a shield," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the only thing that makes this fortress feel like a home." Her eyes opened, and for the first time, he saw them soften completely, the guarded walls crumbling to reveal the warmth within. "You're safe with me, Jin-woo," she said, her voice a low, steady promise. It was everything he needed to hear. In that moment, he realized his wealth, his empire, his power. It was all hollow. True power was this feeling, this sense of absolute safety and trust in another person's hands. He had hired her to protect his life, but somewhere along the way, she had quietly, fiercely, saved his soul. Their relationship shifted after that night. The professional distance was replaced by an easy intimacy. They still maintained their roles. She was his protector, he her principal, but beneath the surface, a deep and abiding affection bloomed. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts. He told her of the crushing weight of his father's legacy, the isolation of his position, a life spent in a gilded cage. She spoke of her father, a former Special Forces soldier who had tried to leave the world of violence behind, only to lose his life protecting his neighborhood from the very gangs he had tried to escape. She had inherited his skills, but also his weariness of conflict. "I never wanted this life," she confessed one evening, tracing patterns on the condensation of her teacup. "I just wanted to be invisible. To be normal. There is nothing normal about you, Raven," Jin-woo said gently, his hand covering hers on the table. "You are extraordinary. And you're not invisible. Not to me." His words were a balm to a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. With him, she didn't have to hide her strength. She could just be. He, in turn, began to shed the armor of the Mafia boss when they were alone. He smiled more, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He learned to cook alongside her, his precise, methodical nature making him a surprisingly good student in the kitchen. They created a small, peaceful world for themselves within the cold walls of the penthouse, a sanctuary from the violence that still lurked outside. The threat of the Red Vipers, however, remained. Jin-woo's informants discovered their leader was planning a final, all-out assault, not on the penthouse, but on one of Jin-woo's legitimate businesses, intending to cause a public spectacle that would ruin him. "They want to draw me out," Jin-woo said, studying a map of the building. "They know they can't get to me here, so we don't go," Raven said simply. "We let your men handle it." "No," he said, his expression hardening with a resolve she hadn't seen before. I have spent my life hiding behind walls and other people. They attacked me because they saw me as weak, isolated. They will not be defeated by my army. They will be defeated by me. By us, he looked at her, and she saw a new kind of strength in his eyes. It wasn't the cold power of a crime lord, but the quiet courage of a man ready to defend his own life, his own future. This ends now, he said. Together, Raven felt a surge of pride. He was no longer the passive man in the diner booth. He was standing up, not just to his enemies, but to the life that had been forced upon him. She nodded, her decision absolute. Together, they were no longer protector and protected. They were partners. The night of the planned attack, they didn't wait for the Red Vipers to make their move. They went to them. Using his intelligence network, Jinwoo located their staging ground, a derelict warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. He went with only a handful of his most trusted men, but at his side, leading the way, was Raven. She moved through the shadows of the warehouse with a lethal grace, disabling sentries silently, clearing a path. Jinwoo followed, armed and focused, moving with a confidence she had helped him build. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. The Red Vipers, caught completely by surprise, were thrown into chaos. Raven was a whirlwind of controlled violence, her movements precise and disabling, while Jinwoo provided cover, his aim steady, his commands clear. They fought back to back, a seamless unit, anticipating each other's moves, protecting each other's blind spots. When the last of the Vipers was subdued, the leader stood alone, facing them, his face the mask of disbelief. A woman, he spat, looking at Raven with contempt. You let a woman fight your battles, Quan? Jinwoo stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Raven, a mirror of the way she had shielded him for months. This woman, he said, his voice ringing with cold authority in the cavernous space, is stronger than any army you could ever muster. And she is not my soldier. She is my partner, the Viper leader lunged, a desperate, final act. Jinwoo didn't flinch. He disarmed him with a clean, efficient move Raven had taught him just weeks before, the man's knife skittering across the concrete floor. The fight was over. The threat was neutralized. Standing in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the defeated, Jinwoo turned to Raven. The grime and sweat of the fight couldn't diminish the clarity in his eyes. He saw his future standing before him, and it was a future he wanted to build with her, not in the shadows of the underworld, but in the light. He reached into his pocket, his hand steady. He pulled out a small velvet box. Raven's breath caught in her throat. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring with a single, clear diamond that seemed to capture all the light in the dim warehouse. I spent my life building an empire of glass and steel, he began, his voice low and earnest. It was cold and empty. You walked in and filled it with light. You showed me what true strength is. It's not about power or control. It's about having someone to stand with, back to back, against the world. He went down on one knee on the dusty concrete floor, holding the ring up to her. I don't want you to be my shield anymore, Raven. I want you to be my wife, my partner, my equal, in everything. Marry me. Tears welled in Raven's eyes, tears of shock, of joy, of a profound, bone-deep sense of coming home. All her life, she had been fighting. For survival, for her family, for peace. Now, this man was offering her not just a sanctuary, but a partnership, a life. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood, and she stepped into his arms, holding him tightly. The war was over. Their life was just beginning.